firstly, posting before Batsanya. So I want to thank Rav Schreiber for his very kind and generous and warm words. In addition to being a very special, obviously, relationship. And, he mentioned that he is a Talmud of mine, one of my excellent Talmidim. I've had many wonderful Talmidim. He is one of them, but he has the distinction of being, in my first Shiur. I'm sure I've said that in the past, but, it always bears repeating. He was in my Shiur the first year that I was a Maggid Shiur. And then he came here to Yeshivat HaRetzion for a couple of years, and then he was back in my Shiur. So we, Baruch Hashem, have been connected, for, I don't know whether I should count the years. It doesn't really matter to me. They're a little bit, high, but that's a little bit unbelievable. It doesn't really affect much, but it's a very long and a very wonderful relationship, and a very consistent one, in that there's the personal element as well as the appreciation for somebody who in his own right is, Ram B'Chesed, and somebody who's a Marbitz Torah. So really it's, in addition to hearing nice things that he said, which I appreciate, but from whence they come, as they say, is, significant as well. And as he noted, I am a boger of Yeshivat HaRetzion. I also learned in Yeshivat Rabbi Yitzchak Al-Chanan, where I've been a Rosh Yeshiva for many years and a Rosh Kollel. But before I was there, I was here, and in very formative years. I was really only here for, people are often surprised because they're aware of my connection. It was really only a year and a half, or a little bit less than a year and a half, but that's a little bit misleading. It was a very intense year and a half, and more than that, it was a year and a half that was very, not only formative, but created relationships that continued, for decades and decades and decades. Sounds like a lot of decades, but there were. In terms of my, first and foremost, my bond and my sense of appreciation as a Talmud, and my bond with both of the Rosh Yeshiva, Zechronim Levracha, Rav Yehuda Mital, of course, who was such a wonderful man, and Mori Rabbi, together with Rav Soloveitchik, my two Rabbeim Muvakim, but Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who, again, I was technically in his shiur only for, about a year and a half, but a lifelong Talmud of both, and especially the connection with Rav Lichtenstein was one of a Rebbe Talmud that lasted, till his Petira, and continues as Demus Diukno continues to be very powerful. I think we're supposed to speak about that later. They told me to speak about nostalgia, but I'm not so good about nostalgia, but I'll do what I can. When is that? 6:30. Well, let's make it a little earlier maybe, or we'll figure it out. Okay. But I just wanted to say that whenever I come to Yeshivat HaRetzion, there's an element of, coming home, and especially an appreciation for the impact that the yeshiva had and continues to have on me. And of course, in addition to that, I have shared, many, many, many Talmidim with this yeshiva over the years, and continued to do that and appreciate that partnership with the present Rosh Yeshiva, who I know very well and who I have great, wonderful friendships, very warm feelings towards. So it's really special to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. Midei shana b'shana, it's always a schus. So they asked me to speak originally about Pesach, about Psachim, and then they changed it to, in Yani Chanukah, which is a different kind of a shiur. But I thought we would take one topic and examine. We don't have time to do it fully or definitively or comprehensively, but at least examine some aspects, raise some questions, some food for thought, discuss some of the shitos and their implication, and hopefully, in addition to the narrow issue itself, the status of Ha-Nisim in Tefillah and in Birchas Hamazon, but as I think I titled it, the Tiv Chiyuv Hoda Upirsum, I think there is a very interesting phenomenon that emerges from some of the Makoros, at least, that, in addition to the topic itself, is, I think, a consistent highlight on Inyane Chanukah, and what stands behind the importance of the events of Chanukah, the Nes of Chanukah, and therefore the Shevach v'Hodah that it triggers as well. Hopefully that will become clear as we move forward. But let's begin with the topic itself. So the Gemara in Masechet Shabbos on Daf Chaf Dalid, Amud Aleph, raises the following question. And again, there's no time to exhaust this, so I'm just going to throw out some things along the way, food for thought for people to ruminate about and perhaps follow up. The Gemara says, Iboilahu, Ma'u lahaskir shel Chanukah bebirchas hamazon. What about mentioning, this is a reference, of course, to Ha-Nisim, what about inserting, a reference to Chanukah in Birchas Hamazon? And the Gemara outlines the tzdadim, if you will, of this chakira, like what's the issue, whether or not you should mention Chanukah and Birchas Hamazon. To all of us, we're very familiar, with our practice, the normative practice, which is that we do say Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon. So it already, is important to understand that there's a history to this question. It wasn't simple to the Gemara. And as we'll see, there are different shades of the Gemara's perspective on this issue, which surely in their own right are significant, but in a broader way as well. So what are the tzdadim? On the one hand, kivin de b'drabanan hu lo mid karinan. It's only a din d'Rabbanan, and therefore Chanukah was a takana d'Rabbanan. Rambam calls it divrei sofrim, and therefore lo midakrinan. There's no reason, doesn't have enough stature, or maybe it's not an issue that is connected to the Kedushas Hayom. We'll see in a moment. Odilma, the other side, is that Mishum Persume Nisa Midakrinan. Because it conveys Persume Nisa, so that is different. So this already, not something we can pursue extensively, but the Gemara in a number of places is, discusses whether or not Persume Nisa, changes or elevates the status of Chanukah vis-a-vis other things. I mean, Chanukah and Purim were both part of Megillas Tainis, and as such, dilo lisped bahon v'lo dilis anos bahon. It was an Isser of Tainis and Hesped in connection, with all Megillas Tainis. But the Gemara tells us that, Megillas Tainis was Batel, and the exception was Purim and Chanukah, and partly because of this principle of Pirsume Nisa. When the Gemara discusses, priorities, if you have to make a difficult decision, like you have to pick between, let's say, a Neiros Chanukah financially, or resource-wise, between Neiros Chanukah and like Kiddush Hayom. So the Gemara also discusses, in these contexts, and it's worthwhile putting them all together, whether Pirsume Nisa changes the equation, or not. And the question is, how do you understand the value added of Pirsume Nisa? Is Pirsume Nisa just a way of, putting, Neiros Chanukah, or in this case, Ha-Nisim, over the top? In other words, in its own right, it would be inadequate because it's only, a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, but this is a, singular mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Maybe that's all you need. And therefore, the added factor of Pirsume Nisa doesn't transform how we look at Neiros Chanukah per se. It's more that, as I say, it's, you don't have to treat it in typical mitzvah d'Rabbanan fashion. It has, an elevated status, but not one that transforms our whole perspective, on what this means. Or, alternatively, in the most extreme, is this meant to contrast with the din d'Rabbanan? We say, kivin de b'drabbanan hu, right, it is d'Rabbanan on a certain level, in the sense that it's not minat Torah, it was nitkan by the Chachamim at a certain point, but maybe the fact that this d'Rabbanan is mefarsem Nisa, maybe that gives it a doraisa, dimension. Call it a kiyum doraisa. And say from Mitzvah Sajugon, for example, or Rabbi Yerucham Fischel Perlo, discusses in general whether Persume Nisa, doesn't have, isn't an aspect of either Avas Hashem, or if there is a mitzvah doraisa of Hallel, which is also debated. Rambam holds that it's only midivrei sofrim, but possible that others think that it is doraisa. So does Persume Nisa qualify something as Hallel? Meaning, is it possible that on a kiyum level, Persume Nisa actually upgrades Chanukah not to a chiyuv doraisa, but to some sort of a kiyum doraisa at least, or maybe this is a mechayev in its own right. It's not that it makes it doraisa, but instead of looking at Chanukah again in typical fashion, and instead of not suggesting that it's a kiyum doraisa, we're not saying it's only a regular derabanan plus, but maybe the factor of Persume Nisa is a mechayev that is just treated differently when it comes to issues having to do with, or related to the issue that we're dealing with here, which is midakrinale. Is it something that you should be, harping on, mentioning whenever you can, whenever you have, the opportunity? If you're in a context in which Persume Nisa is possible, maybe, it's not a doraisa and it's not a drabanan plus, which normally would be me'ena ma'ora, let's say, and therefore would qualify. But maybe Persume Nisa itself is a mechai. We'll talk more, about that, as we go on. Yeah. So the Gemara's maskana is equally fascinating. The Gemara says, Omar Rava, Omar Rav Schora, Omar Rav Huna, Eino maskir. So if you stop right there, that would, put an end to that. Then we'd all be wondering, why it is that we feel so guilty when we forget to say Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon. If we do, and I guess we'd feel even more guilty if we said it, that we were mafsik, when we shouldn't. It sounds like Rav Huna says that you shouldn't say it, right? A negative. However, very interesting that the Gemara continues and says, Vimba lahazkir mazkir bahoda. That's a very strange answer. In other words, the Gemara was contemplating the possibility that you would insert this in the same place you put, let's say, ritzei or yalav yavo, and you would treat it as like, being mazkir me'ena ma'ora, as if it was a kind of a kedushas hayom, let's say, even though there's no Isra Malacha on Chanukah, there's no Kiddush on Chanukah, but maybe it's a kind of me'en ha'ma'ora. That was the Gemara's consideration. And the Gemara is saying, no, you don't do that, but you can mention it if you put it in the section of Hodah. So does it remain a Rishus, or if you're putting it in the section of Hodah, it doesn't sound like it's a Chiyuv, either way, but this combination, Eino Maskir Vimba Hazkir, Maskir B'Hodah, certainly establishes that Ha-Nisim, and by extension Chanukah, but Ha-Nisim on Chanukah has a kind of murky status. That we kind of want to, there's something like compelling us, to say it. At the same time, it doesn't really qualify or fit in to the norms of like Me'en HaMa'ora. But if you want to put it in a different place, then you could or you should. But remember, this comes at a price. Apparently the price is not really a price, and that's important. Meaning, otherwise it would be a hefsek, in Birchas Hamazon. If it doesn't belong there, you can't just put it there, right? Okay, so that is what the Gemara answers. But as I say, that raises more questions, just as the original suffix, what does Persume Nisa add, and does it add enough, is one kind of an issue. So too, on the next overlapping level, we have this question, what is this pshara kind of answer, and how do we understand it? Then the Gemara continues and says, Rav Huna bar Yehuda ikla lebei Rava, savar lad kure bebone Yerushalayim. Now this is really interesting, and in a way it, reinforces our analysis of a second ago, meaning there was two questions. One is, should you insert Ha-Nisim in the benching on Chanukah? And the other question is, where are you going to insert it And is that just a question, a technical question, or is that more of a question like what is the mechayiv? What's the purpose of mentioning it? Is it a kind of me'ina ma'ora, like we'd say, like Yavo, in which case it goes in Bonei Yerushalayim, right? Or is it something different, namely, some sort of a pirsa banes in its own right, in which case it would go, in Birchas Hoda, in No Delacha. So that's what the Gemara tells us, that there was, this experience that Rabbi had, that Savar Lad Kurei Biboni Yerushalayim, and Amalei Rav Shesha said to him, Kitfila, Ma Tfila Behoda, Af Birchas Hamazon Behoda. And he said to him, no, you can say it, you should say it, but you should insert it, right, in the right place. So again, it's just a technical question of where to put it, unlikely. It's more an issue of what the nature of this heter is, kiyum is. Doesn't sound at all, like it's a chiyuv. There's another issue in the Gemara, and that is that the Gemara implies here, question how strongly, that the question of Ha-Nisim, which, as we know, has two applications. One is Birchas Hamazon, which is what the Gemara starts with, and the other is Tefillah. But it sounds as if the Gemara thought that they weren't identical, or thought at least that there was more information or more reason to be saying Ha-Nisim in Tefillah than in Birchas Hamazon. Hence, when the Gemara says that, Ma Tefillah B'hoda, Af Birchas Hamazon, no, Man Dekar Shemei, who's speaking about Tefillah. Meaning, it's like, just like in Tefillah, there's no question that you don't put it, where you would put, Yalav Yavo, etc. You don't put it in Ritzei, etc. You put it in, Hoda, the Birchas Hoda. So too, Birchas Hamazon. And that is something that some Rishonim took even further, as we'll see. They understood that it's not just that, we have more information about Tefillah, and therefore Tefillah can serve as a, as a source of a makor, if you will, for Birchas Hamazon. But it sounds like, Birchas Hara, this Ha-Nisim is something that is more mat'im to Tefillah. It's more of a chiyuv, perhaps. We'll see in a moment. And as such, you look to Tefillah for guidance in terms of the nature of this chiyuv as well. And the question is why, if there's a question whether to integrate Ha-Nisim into Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon, right? Why should there be this difference? Okay. So with respect to that question, let's just talk about a few possibilities. So it's interesting, the Balei Tosas suggests a technical reason why Tefillah would be a more appropriate venue for Ha-Nisim than Birchas Hamazon. Tosas says, B'Tefillah pshitale demazkir, mishum B'Tefillah b'tziburhu, v'ikir presume nisa. Aval Birchas Hamazon shebebayis leikir presume nisa kulaha. So Balei Tosas do assume that there's a greater, more compelling reason to insert Ha-Nisim into Tefillah than into Birchas Hamazon, but for technical reasons, namely Pirsume Nisa and the presence of a tzibur. If you look in the back of the Gemara, they have comments of the various achronim. So there's a comment of the Cheshek Shlomo, Shlomo Vilna, who basically says, if this is true, then I would like to make a case that on Purim, where you also have the issue of Ha-Nisim, talk a little bit about the contrast, and you'll see the range in just a minute, that in Purim, where the Seuda isn't, a private matter, but, the Mishta, the Simcha is, a critical aspect of, the upfront, celebration of Purim, and the expectation is that there'll be people there, and that it in itself is a kind of a pirsum anes. He says, if that would be the case, it would be a davar pashut that the Birchas Hamazon of Purim would require Ha-Nisim, even if the Birchas Hamazon of Chanukah does not require Ha-Nisim. That, of course, is a very interesting question. We'll see the opposite view, at least with regard to tefillah, in just a minute. And this touches on a very important, broader issue that I'm not going to be able to pursue much, but again, it's worth thinking about. And that is, of course, that, Megillah and Kriyas HaMegillah and Purim on the one hand, and Chanukah and Neiros Chanukah on the other hand, are obviously the exceptions to the bittul of Megillah's Tainus. And the Rambam actually chose to organize, Sefer Zmanim by integrating, Megillah and Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah. That's why Hilchos Chanukah, begins in Perek Gimel. The question is, to what extent, are there parallels between them and differences between them? And if there are differences, are they, fundamental despite the commonality between them, or are they small, differences, to compensate, but basically the themes are similar. So this question of, and we'll see some others, just, agav, but it's a topic in its own right, of the exact relationship between these two, Pirsumei Nisa-oriented, rabbinic, holidays, which also may have kiyum and daraisa, is an interesting question. And therefore the comment of the Cheshek Shlomo, that even though the Gemara is mistapek, about Chanukah, it, would have said vadai by Purim, which is not obvious at all. Even if it is true, there might be another reason. So let me mention that, or two other reasons. One is, we'll discuss this a little more fully in a moment, that the whole idea of inserting Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon may depend on whether or not there is a Chiyuv Seuda on Chanukah. Vadai, there is a Chiyuv Seuda on Purim. Question is there a Chiyuv Seuda on Chanukah? We'll speak about this a little more extensively in a couple of minutes. But basically, just for now, that constitutes a very basic machlokas. The Maram Rutenberg understood Rashi, we'll talk about the Rashi in a minute, as being of the opinion that there's no chiyuv of Seuda on Chanukah. He made a point of the fact that if you want to turn a Seudas Chanukah into a Seudas Mitzvah, you need Divrei Torah. So it's always good to have Divrei Torah anyway, but whether that's a sine qua non for turning a Seudas Chanukah into a Seudas Mitzvah, that is debatable. The Marshal understood that, at least according to the Rambam, we'll again see some of this in just a minute. There's a Chiyuv Seuda on Chanukah separate from anything else, meaning, so of course this question whether Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon is a requirement or not may very much depend on how you look at this question. Is this the proper event? Tefillah, of course, is something that is indispensable. It's avodah shebelev. It's something that you say every single day. There's an added maybe dimension of tefillah on days in which you're also commemorating nisim v'niflos, and that is expressed in other things. But as for Birchas Hamazon, it would be reasonable to think, if you were talking about the relationship between Purim or Chanukah, or just in its own right, you were thinking, of whether or not, Birchas Hamazon is the right venue for Ha-Nisim. So you might say it depends. It doesn't have to depend. If you're eating anyway and you're, saying Birchas Hamazon, maybe it's an opportunity, or maybe the tefillah of Birchas Hamazon anyways is mechayev. Talk about that also. But the idea that this could be Haba Hatalia is very reasonable. Even if you were to take the view that there is a Chiyuv Seuda on Chanukah, which is the view of the Marshal and the Bach and others, they feel it's rooted in the Rambam. We'll discuss in just a minute. It's still possible to be mechalek between Purim and Chanukah. And not for Purim reasons. Namely, in Purim, there's not only a Chiyuv Seuda, the Seuda, is a central part of the commemoration and celebration. The Ad Kedei Kach, that it's more than a Seuda. If you look at the, psukim in the Megillah, in the end, when, they were kind of contemplating the policy, how they were going to commemorate, Purim L'Dorei Doros. So there's a change in the order of the psukim. Initially, the suggestion was that they would make Purim a day of simcha u'mishteh, in the final rendition of the Megillah, it got turned around, and they decided, and that's the final decision was to make it a day of Mishteh v'Simcha. What's the difference between Simcha and Mishteh v'Simcha? Probably the kind of Suda, and the role of the Suda. If you say Simcha Mishteh, then what you're saying is that there's a Chiyuv Simcha, and one of the ways to express that, maybe a prime way to express that, is by having a meal. But if you think the meal itself is supposed to generate the Simcha, not to reflect it, not to manifest it, but to trigger it, and that makes it a different kind of a Simcha. So we're all familiar with the fact, we don't have to speak extensively because it's not Purim right now, but the whole tone and temper of Purim is very different than any other day of the year, right? Including Chanukah. It's part of the challenge, that I referred to before. There's so much overlap and common between them that it also accentuates the differences, makes them more acute as well. But one of those things is that Purim is a day in which, through physical pleasure and, the raising of one's, or the heightening of one's consciousness, the Hanei ben Yavin, one expresses one's, appreciation for the Hashgacha. And that's probably what is signified by the flip from Simcha to Mishteh. Every Yom Tov has a din of Simcha, and every Yom Tov, therefore, has a Chiyuv Seuda. But the idea that the Simcha should be generated by the Mishteh, giving it, more of a causal and more of a primal status, that is something limited to Purim. So if one were to say that, even if there's a Chiyuv Suda, both on Chanukah and on Purim, that the Chiyuv on Purim would generate more of an obligation to say Ha-Nisim than Chanukah, that would be like a reasonable expectation. We'll soon see that the Avnei Nezer in a tshuva suggests, not with regard to Birchas Hamazon, but with regard to Tefillah, the opposite. That maybe there's a greater obligation to say Ha-Nisim on Chanukah than on Purim, but we'll put that in context in just a couple of minutes. Okay, Rashi had a different take on this issue. Rashi's take is very, very important. Rashi says, like the Balei Tosas, earlier than the Balei Tosas, that when the Gemara says, you can say Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon, however, right, you must insert it, in Hoda'ah, and we know that from Tefillah. So Rashi says explicitly that that implies that Tefillah is a more core venue for Ha-Nisim than is Birchas Hamazon. Question is why? So here Rashi explains, Ma Tefillah b'Birchas Hoda'ah, Dohakula milsa de Chanukah, ikara lehoda'a nitkana. That's a very interesting line. I'll read it again. Dohakula milsa de Chanukah, I mean the whole essence of Chanukah, ikara lehoda'a nitkana. What does that have to do with saying Ha-Nisim in Tefillah? I mean, it's a very powerful statement, and in its own right, it deserves our attention. Right, that the yesod of the primary theme of Chanukah is Hoda'ah. But how does that explain ma Tefillah's primacy? So the answer, seems to be in Rashi L'Shitaso on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. Before I get to that, I'll just contrast it with how the Avnei Nezer understood it. Although he didn't really. It's interesting, he says two different things. The Avnei Nezer in a tshuva, which I'll get to in just a minute, says, what does Rashi mean by this? He says, what he means by it is that, formally, in Tefillah, we call, Modim Birchas Hoda'ah. In Birchas Hamazon, says the Avnei Nezer, I'll read the language in a minute, we don't call Nodelecha Birchas Hoda'ah, we call it Birchas Haaretz. So what Rashi meant was, since the yesod of Chanukah is Hoda'ah, a big statement, right? So therefore, it expresses itself more acutely in Tefillah than in Birchas Hamazon, because Tefillah has an official Birchas Hodah, whereas Birchas Hamazon does not. It's integrated with Birchas Haaretz. However, it would seem that what Rashi meant was more than that, not just a linguistic or maybe you could say it's a reflection. The concept of, or the capacity to convey Hodah is greater in Tefillah. The Haraya, it has a dedicated, Birchas Hodah as opposed to Birchas Hamazon. I think that's a little bit bedochak, especially since, and I'm going to speak about this point later on, Birchas Hamazon on a certain level is the ultimate Birchas Hodah. There are very few brachos that are doraisa. There's a debate in the Rishonim whether Tefillah is doraisa. Shelo Bizman, the Ramban, of course, in Sefer Mitzvah says, Ba'ad Bizman Eis Tzara, Tefillah is doraisa, but not at any other time. The Rambam happens to be the maverick Shita, but like in many other things, his powerful voice, is so dominating, that everybody thinks everybody holds like the Rambam. But the Rambam Shita, of course, is that Tefillah Kol Yom is doraisa. But the majority view in the Rishonim is like the Ramban, and that is that Tefillah B'Chol Yom is D'Rabbanan. But Birchas Hamazon, everybody agrees is doraisa. And Birchas Hamazon, when you think about it, is the ultimate expression of Hodah. That's what Birchas Hamazon is. The Yerushalmi explains that Shomea Ka'ona doesn't apply to Tefillah, doesn't apply to Kriya Shema, each for different reasons. It doesn't apply to Birchas Hamazon. The famous line, of why that is Mi Sha'achal, like hu Yevarech. You can't farm out, you can't, do by, remote control, Hodah. Hodah is like a very highly, personal, element. So Birchas Hamazon doesn't have Shomea Ka'ona. Birchas Hamazon, according to some Rishonim, is like the only bracha doraisa. I mean, the Ramban happens to hold that Birchas Torah is also doraisa. Maybe the Rambam holds that way. It's hard to know. Likely not. But for most Rishonim, brachos, the general class of brachos are all d'Rabbanan, right? And the one bracha that everybody agrees is doraisa, frankly, is the achalta v'savata uveirachta, and that, of course, is Hodah. So the idea that, there's a bracha called, Birchas Hodah and Shmona Esrei, that makes it, or that reflects Shmona Esrei as a better venue, per se, I think is a very difficult idea. Of course, what I'm saying may also be a reason, when you think objectively about it, to think that maybe, Ha-Nisim, which is an expression of Hodah, belongs more in Birchas Hamazon than it does in Tefillah. So we'll see if we find shitos, that say that, as well. But either way, there seems to be another point in Rashi that doesn't contradict the ha'ara of the Avnei Nezer, but that seems to be really connected to what he says. And that, of course, is his comment on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. On Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, we have the famous Brisa, where the Gemara says, I think Rabbi Schreiber reminded me that I might have spoken about this last year, about the idea of Be-Chanuka and this Brisa, but we'll talk about it briefly for our purposes today as well. So the on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, the Gemara says, Be-Chanuka. And that, is best translated, not as Rashi translates as it happens. Rashi says, what is the nace, which triggered al eza nace kava'uha. I think a better translation of Be-Chanuka is, what is the essence of Chanukah? There are a lot of things happening on Chanukah. There are a lot of moving parts. Like what crystallized, what's the main theme or themes? Or if there are themes, overlapping themes, that, project like a very single and singular kind of message. So the Gemara tells the story. Malchus Beis Chashmonai v'nitzcham badku v'lematzo lepakachad shel shemen she'imunach b'chasama shel kohen gadol v'lo hayabal lahadlik yom echad nasa boneis v'dliku shmona yamim shana cheres. Here's the important part: kiva'um v'asaum yamim tovim b'halo v'hoda. So if you want to know what's quintessential, what's quintessential to Chanukah, right? It's the description of the nace of the Pach HaShemen, which led to a kvius of Yomim Tovim, Hallel, Vehoda. So it sounds like there's a triad. There are three elements, right, which are critical. Hopefully they're overlapping, or maybe they're separate, right? That defines Chanukah, right? They are Yom Tov, Yomim Tovim, Hallel, and Hodah. The question now is, what do they mean, right? We have normally these are not, difficult terms to translate, but when it comes to this particular application, it isn't so simple. So Rashi famously, here on Chaf Aleph on the base, says two things. Number one, that Yomim Tovim is not an independent component. Lo shasurim b'malacha, says Rashi. Rashi, assumed that the word Yom Tov always has to, if you're going to take it seriously and it's going to be a standalone factor, it always has to express itself in Isur Malacha. That's a very fascinating view. I mean, typically it does. If you look at the Parsha of Emor, which is the Parsha of Mikra Kodesh, of Yom Tovim, the truth is, every time it says Mikra Kodesh, which means Yom Tov, right, it says, practically, Kol Melechas Avoda Lo Sas. And that's undoubtedly where this comes from. And that's what Rashi says. Is there Isur Malacha on Chanukah? B'Pashtus, there's not. Although there were echoes of an idea of Isur Malacha, in that some people said women during the time of Hadlakas Neiros shouldn't do Malacha. And then there were poskim who said, and if there's a minhag that other people don't do Malacha, or they don't do Malacha all day, some people have that minhag all day, every day, right, all year round, not just on Chanukah. But if they meant because of Chanukah, so then he said you shouldn't dissuade people from it. It's a good minhag. Maybe there's an element of Yom Tov, according to some poskim, at least a kind of a kiyum of state. You have this issue again in Purim, say that, kol osa malacha bepurim eino roa simin bracha. But there it's clearer. The Rambam and the Orchos Chaim, based on the Rambam, really extended that instead of saying, it's like a side point. It's not nice. You shouldn't be distracted on Purim. Like, you don't have to, get your office work done on Purim. In a roa simin bracha. But the Rambam significantly extended it to imply that even though it's not ma'akev, right, it's really inappropriate to do malacha, on Purim, and the Orchos Chaim even further. Similarly, you have poskim who say something similar about Chanukah. But having said that, there is no actual Isur Malacha. Rashi didn't think there's any Isur Malacha. So then what does it mean? So the answer is Shelo Nikbu Ela Likros HaHalel, meaning it's a Yom Tov of Hallel. It's not three things, it's two things. But by calling it a Yom Tov of Hallel, that, I should just say, it promotes in a very significant way the stature of Chanukah and the Hallel on Chanukah. And Velomar Al Ha-Nisim Behoda. All the Gemara says is Hoda. Hallel, fine. Hallel means Hallel. What does Hoda mean? So Rashi says Hoda means the saying of Al Ha-Nisim. So if that's the case, now we can understand what Rashi meant on Daf Chav Daled. And on Daf Chav Daled, Rashi is trying to explain why did the Gemara assume, right, that we have more information or it's more compelling to be saying Al Ha-Nisim in Tefillah more than in Birchas Hamazon. Rashi says because Al Ha-Nisim is because the whole day it's Ikar Hoda. But we understand now what Rashi means on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, when the Gemara says that the essence of Chanukah, my Chanukah, ends up being a Yom Tov, according to Rashi, of Hallel and Hoda. So now Rashi says, and that means Al Ha-Nisim. So what he's saying is, forget about Birchas Hamazon. You have to say it in Tefillah. Birchas Hamazon, you're going to eat bread, you're not going to eat bread, right? Let me add more. There are two elements, maybe L'shitasa. Because Rashi says that Yom Tov means a Yom Tov of Hallel and Hoda, that is where the Maram Rutenberg made his diuk that there's no chiyuv seuda on Chanukah. He said if it was a chiyuv seuda or simcha on Chanukah, then Rashi would have said that's the pshat of Yom Tov. I'm not sure if that's the best diuk per se, objectively, but what I am sure is that this Maram Rutenberg got a lot of currency. I mean, the Maram Rutenberg was a weighty figure, an authoritative figure. So this was his diuk, and this diuk, people ran with it. It's very prominent. Like if you look at the poskim, everybody talks about Rothenberg's view that there is no chiyuv suda, and it's based on this Rashi. Rashi said there's no real Yom Tov, not even with respect to Su'uda, and as such, it's something else. Now, if that's the case, so we can appreciate even further that when Rashi says that it's a Yom Tov of Hodah, and on Chav Daled he says Hodah is the most Ikar, even more than Hallel maybe, right? Of course it has to be B'tfilah, because there's no Chiyuv Suda. We spoke before about whether or not the Chiyuv Suda could have impact on whether or not you say Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon, but certainly if there's no Chiyuv Suda, it's very possible that you're not eating bread and you're not having a Suda, right? But you have to say Ha-Nisim every day of Chanukah, according to Rashi, because that's what Kiva'u v'yasuhu, Yamim shel Yom Tov, Hallel v'Hodah. So that the Hodah part is saying Ha-Nisim. You have to daven every day, right? You don't have to say Birchas Hamazon every day. Many people don't say Birchas Hamazon every day if there's no Chiyuv Suda, right? So, and even if you do, it's a coincidence, whereas the davening obviously is a more prominent perch, if you will, for Ha-Nisim. So if you put it all together, Rashi's negation of Su'uda, if Rothenberg is right, but more importantly, his assertion of the role of Ha-Nisim, makes his comment on Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph that's why tefillah is the the makar, if you will, for birchas. It can't be more than tefillah. Tefillah is more fundamental, and that is Rashi's shita. Okay. If this is the case, then it becomes possible to think that maybe there are two dinim of Ha-Nisim, right? In other words, there's one din of Ha-Nisim because my Chanukah, kiva'uhu v'yasuhu, so every day you have to say Ha-Nisim, and that is the Ha-Nisim of Tefillah. If that's the case, then again, it's not b'toras me'ena ma'ora. It's not like, Yala v'yavo or, the Hazkarat of Shabbos, in Kedushas Hayom. Because this is not a Kedushas Hayom issue. It's not me'ena ma'ora. It's part of my Chanukah. Just like you have to say Hallel, right? You have to, at some point, express the Hodah by means of Ha-Nisim. Why Dafka Ha-Nisim? We'll get to the text a little bit later, hopefully. So actually, the Avnei Nezer, I'll read again the language in a minute, but, he kind of gets a little distracted with some other point. But when he comes back to it, he says, the chiyuv of Ha-Nisim, according to Rashi, he says this, not me'ena ma'ora, which maybe is what it is in Birchas Hamazon. Maybe it's it's a chovas Chanukah. So I think that you might have been, whether you say it at all, in Birchas Hamazon as opposed to Tefillah, could be explained on that way, on that basis. Or maybe in terms of, in theory, whether you're choser, let's say you don't say, Ha-Nisim, do you have to be choser? Or do you have to find some other way, at least to express the Ha-Nisim? We'll see this and its opposite in a few minutes. Before we get to that, in light of this, I want to make a comment about Tosas. Tosas, in addition to the one that I already mentioned, asks a question. Tosas says, how come this sugya of, saying Ha-Nisim, during Birchas Hamazon, how come it appears on Chav Daled Amud Aleph in Perek B'Mem Adlikin? It should have appeared earlier when the Gemara, just to explain, Perek B'Mem Adlikin is the, locus classicus, meaning it's the, the main, treatment of Dinei Chanukah. Right? Why? Because, they're talking about Shemen and Neros, of Shabbos. So Agav, the Gemara speaks about, this is the main sugyas of Chanukah, as are in the second parak of Shabbos. But by the time you reach Chav Daled Amud Aleph, Chanukah's over. Not the holiday, but the treatment, of the topic. Chav Aleph, Chav Beis, Chav Gimel you have, and then it's done. Now it's true that on Chav Daled, the Gemara does speak about Chanukah, right? But it also speaks about, it's in a context where it's examining, what about Rosh Chodesh in Birchas Hamazon? And what about Rosh Chodesh in Musaf, of Shabbos? And what about, Ha-Nisim in Musaf of Shabbos? Even the reason you're saying the Musaf isn't because of the Chanukah, you're saying it because of Rosh Chodesh, or you're saying it because of Shabbos. Meaning, the Gemara has a whole section where they talk about what I'll call convergences. In other words, when you have like the coming together of two Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, Yom Tov, and Yom Tov and Shabbos, Chanukah and Shabbos, Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh, etc. But they finished Dinei Chanukah. So it's very interesting. Tosas asked the question, this should have been in an earlier sugya. He doesn't answer it. If you look at the Rashash, he has a whole, like a pilpul about it. I'm not sure what he's even saying there, but it's just interesting that he's addressing it. But I think, in light of the comment of the Avnei Nezer, and even without the Avnei Nezer, that this is a very important, highlight. Meaning, is the question of whether or not you insert Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon and Tefillah, is that a question about Chanukah, or is that a question about Birchas Hamazon and Tefillah? Right? Meaning, all the Gemaras here in Chavdal and Aleph are about these convergences of trying to figure out, the Mechayiv of Musaf is Shabbos, but it's still Chanukah. So should the Tefillah reflect, all aspects of it? It's a Tefillah of the day, but does that mean that every dimension of the day, even the ones that aren't Mechayiv, this Tefillah, that's what I mean by, is there a chalos, if you will, Tefillas Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, Tefillas Shabbos Chanukah, Tefillas, Shabbos Yom Tov. That's really what the Gemara is discussing. But primarily, that's a question, or that could be a question, about Tefillah. So what you could say is, according to Rashi, and especially in light of Avnei Nezer's ha'ara, that maybe when it comes to Birchas Hamazon, the Gemara's whole discussion is like Me'ena Ma'ora. That's one kind of thing. But when it comes to Tefillah, Kiva'um v'asa'um, their Ha-Nisim it's a Chovas Chanukah. So I thought that's exactly the answer, maybe, to Tosas's question. They'll say, how come we have it here? We should have put it earlier when we were talking about Dinei Chanukah. The answer is the Mechayiv of Birchas Hamazon, of Ha-Nisim Birchas Hamazon, according to this perspective, isn't Chanukah. It is Birchas Hamazon, right? It's a din in Hilchos Birchas Hamazon and Hilchos Tefillah, not a din in Hilchos Chanukah. Okay. Having said that, so now we can maybe better appreciate Shitas HaRambam. So the Rambam's view in general is very fascinating. I think that's what I spoke about last year. I just didn't remember. But I'm just going to touch on it again. Firstly, the Rambam omits the din of Ha-Nisim from Hilchos Chanukah, which is very striking. He speaks about it in Hilchos Tefillah and Hilchos Birchas Hamazon. But in Hilchos Chanukah, there's no mention of Ha-Nisim. This is L'shitaso, in contrast to Rashi, of the way he read the Gemara in Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah, right, Perek Gimel, Halacha Aleph through Gimel, this is probably what I spoke about last year, the Rambam interprets the Brisa of my Chanukah, right? I mean, the Rambam was a codifier, and the Rambam his codification comes from the Gemara, and therefore what we do with the Rambam is we try to understand how he understood the Gemaras, right? So Perek Gimel, Halacha Aleph through Gimel, is the Rambam's rendition of my Chanukah. Bebai Sheni, Kishemolchu Yavon, Gazru Gzeros al Yisrael, Bitlu Datam, V'lo Yinichu Osam, Lasuk B'Torah B'Tzos. I'll get back to it in a minute, because it's very important. There he has an expansion. Then comes Halacha Beis, Kishegav Yisrael, Aloy Ve'em, V'Ibdum, B'Chamisha V'Yesrim Chodesh Kislev V'Aya, all the background. Then comes Halacha Gimel. Mipnei zeh, this is the kava'um va'asa'um. Now, how's the Rambam going to interpret the words Yom Tov, Hallel, Hodah? right? So the mipnei zeh tkinu chachamim shebo sador sheyu shmonos yom elu shetchilason milel chamisha the esrim the kislev yemei. The next few words are going to, or the next few components, right, are going to be the translations of the brisa. So what was the first one in the brisa? Yom Tovim. Simcha. The word Yom Tov doesn't appear here. Simcha appears. Hallel. Hallel is Hallel. Except that the Rambam has a very expansive connection to Hallel, but that's not for now. And the third one is Hoda'ah, which Rashi said was Ha-Nisim, and which the Rambam says is Umadlikin ba'neiros be'erev al piskei abatim b'cholayla v'layla mishmonas haleilos laharis u'legalis hasanes. A very long, you have to take a deep breath before you say the sentence. You have to get it all in. Right? He wrote it that way. Rambam was an amazing writer. You know, he wrote like, you know, he wasn't, you know, a clumsy writer. He was, you know, very comfortable and a very, you know, his prose and his poetry, it's all good. So what kind of run-on, if you, you know, do this, put this for, you know, a sentence for our English composition. So again, if you have a, you know, somebody who's a technically, you know, a professor of composition, they might criticize you. But somebody with a good aesthetic sense, who also understands tochen, would say, ah, that's magnificent. Okay, what do I mean by that? I mean to say, this is a very, very long sentence that the Rambam wrote intentionally, because he was trying to provide a new definition to Hodah. For the Rambam, Hodah is the hadlakas neros be'erev al piskei batim, each night, consistently, laharos ulagalos hanes, that is the Hodah. And this is what I tried to establish last year, that in Perek Daled, halacha yud beis, the Rambam speaks about mitzvah ner Chanukah, mitzvah kaviva hi ad ma'od, also a statement that he, you know, initiated. It doesn't say in the Gemara anywhere that mitzvah Chanukah. It is fascinating that the Bali Tosos in Sukkah also use the expression that it's a mitzvah chaviva. They want to explain why there's a birchas haroah in Chanukah. The Ram here wants to explain something else, but they fascinating. They use the same. It's an endearing mitzvah, right? But tzarich adam lihizaher bo kedei lodia hanes lahosif b'shevach hakel v'hodayalo Ha-Nisim she'asalon. Probably last year, if this is what I spoke about, I probably tried to explain, you know, why would doing a mitzvah constitute an act of Hodah? And I might get back to part of that explanation. But the takeaway for the moment, since that's not our topic, is that the Rambam interpreted the words Hodah in the Brisa as a reference to Hadlakas Neros Chanukah. Agav, two things. Number one, the Bach, which I put in the Mar Makomos, you know, has a ha'ara which he says, I don't understand why this brisa omitted Neros Chanukah. Unless he says, some people have the girsa or the interpretation that asa'um and kiva'um mean two different things. One refers to Neros Chanukah, the other refers to the Yomim Tovim, Hallel, and Hodah. We said, but if you don't think that's true, then why would they omit Neros Chanukah? But according to the Rambam, they didn't omit it. That's the word Hodah means. And the Piskei Rid interprets this way as well. It's a very remarkable idea. But for our purposes right now, what's important about it is not what he says, but what he excludes. Meaning the Rambam did two things. Yom Tov, he turned into Simcha. He doesn't think that there are two components. He thinks there are three. And the word Yom Tov means Simcha. Secondly, Hodah doesn't mean Ha-Nisim. Hodah means Hadlakas Neros Chanukah, which may explain why the Rambam, I wouldn't say banished, because Ha-Nisim is an amazing, you know, recitation, as we'll discuss, but he omitted it at least from Hilchos Chanukah. How did he know to omit it from Hilchos Chanukah? Well, it's not as, like, unlike Rashi, it's the opposite of Rashi. Right? Rashi said that's the Ikar, because for Rashi, it's a Yom Tov of Hallel and Hodah, and maybe the Hodah even more, and that's the saying of Ha-Nisim. For Rashi, Ha-Nisim appears in two sugyas. One is Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, which has nothing to do with Birchas Hamazon or Tefillah, it doesn't mention them. That's the Chiyuv, that's what Chanukah is all about. It's my Chanukah. right? That's why the Avnei Nezer nicely calls it a chovas Chanuka, not just a me'ena ma'ora for the tefillah or for the birchas hamazon. And then it appears a second time when the Gemara, wants to know, what about birchas hamazon, right? And then the Gemara says, well, if you're going to put it in, you have to put it in Odah. That's what you do in tefillah, implying, and that's how Rashi's interpreting, that tefillah, but the Rambam, in a way, that's not true for the Rambam. There aren't two sugyas of Ha-Nisim for the Rambam. There's only one sugya of Ha-Nisim for the Rambam. Chav Daled Amud Aleph. That's the only place it appears. Chav Aleph Amud Beis says Odah, but it doesn't mean that. It means something else. So the only place that the Gemara speaks about this issue, now going back to Tosfos for a second, is the place which is no longer Dinei Chanukah. It's really Dinei convergence. What happens when you have a convergence of holidays with respect to Musaf and Birchas Hamazon and Tefillah? That's what Tosfos said. Why didn't he put it 2 dapim earlier when he was talking about Chanukah? Why put it here? In a Hilchos Tefillah Birchas Hamazon. But for the Rambam, maybe that's exactly what reinforced to him the idea. For Rashi, it is earlier in Tefillah, and maybe there are 2 dinim. For the Rambam, there's only one din. It's the din of Me'ena Ma'ora, and that's the Gemara in Chav Daled Amud Aleph. So if that's the case, it doesn't belong in Hilchos Chanukah. It actually belongs in Hilchos Birchas Hamazon or Hilchos Tefillah. That's my suggestion. But let me go a step further. According to the Rambam, according to the Gemara, Bidina de Gemara, you would think that in the end of the day, is there a chiyuv to say Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon? Yes or no? Sounds like no. There's no chiyuv, right? There's a heter or maybe a kiyum, but there's no chiyuv. Like we didn't stop improperly in the reading of the Gemara, so we don't have a problem with our practice, right? But in the end of the day, the Gemara said, lo mad karinan, but if you want to be zocher, wow, I have so many choices. If you want to be zocher, I don't know if I have to drink them all. If you want to be zocher, then you should do it, behodah, as you do it in tefillah, right? Would you walk away from there thinking that there's a chiyuv to do, Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon? Presumably not. However, it's interesting to note, do we have the other Rambams? Or if not, you'll look them up. I don't have it. Or do I? No. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah, and in Hilchos Birchas Hamazon, what you will see is that the Rambam, this is Perek Beis Halacha Vav of Hilchos Brachos, and Perek Beis Halacha Yud Gimel of Hilchos Tefillah. The Rambam says in both places, well, in Hilchos Tefillah he says, we say Ha-Nisim in Tefillah. He doesn't say if you want to say it, you could say it and it's not a hefsek, but make sure you put it in Hodah. Okay. And then in Hilchos Birchas Hamazon, he says, you say Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon, and you put it in Hodah just like you do in Hilchos, just like I wrote in Hilchos Tefillah. So basically, the Rambam accepted part of the Gemara, the part of the Gemara that says that somehow, we know, in Hilchos Tefillah, that it should be in Hodah, and that is the source for applying this Behodah, or the equivalent Hodah, Birchas Hamazon, that the Rambam codified. But it sounds like the Rambam thinks, that the obligation to say Ha-Nisim is equal in Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon. That per se is not problematic, because again, if you think that Ha-Nisim is not mentioned on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, it's true the Gemara does imply that we know more details about Tefillah than Birchas Hamazon, but not necessarily that it's a greater chiyuv. But what does emerge, which is fascinating, is the idea that the Rambam doesn't mention, lo mad karinan, but the Rambam just formulates as a chiyuv. So on a technical level, This fits in with the Girsa of Rabbeinu Hananel on Chavdalid Amud Aleph. And that, it's not uncommon, that the Rambam would, would share the text or the vision, of the world of the Gaonim, of Haigon and the Rabbeinu Hananel, etc. But if you look here on Chavdalid Amud Aleph, it's just fascinating. He says, our Gemara has it very differently. The way the Rach has is, Omar Rava, Mazkir Shel Chanuka, Bebirchas Hamazon, Kitvila, Ma Tvila Behoda, Af Birchas Hamazon Behoda. So it's possible that the Rambam read the Gemara in the following way, that originally the Gemara is mistapek. They're mistapek if you say Birchas Hamazon at all, or they say Ha-Nisim. And if you do say it in Bonei Yerushalayim as kind of a Kedushas Hayom, or do you say it as a Hodah? And then when the Gemara told the story, this is not like probably how Rabbeinu Hananel read the Gemara, right? When they told the story, Rava Savar Lad Kuri Beboni Yerushalayim Omer Rav Sheshes Kitfila Matfila Behoda Av Birchas Hamazon Behoda. What he understood by that was that the Gemara was saying something different, not that lo mad karinan, but if you want, but mad karinan, but dafka behoda. What emerges though, either way, that's probably how we read the Gemara, like Rabbeinu Hananel. That's not the normal way to read the Gemara. But what emerges is that the Rambam equates tefillah and Birchas Hamazon, although tefillah is the source for Birchas Hamazon, like it is in the Gemara. But in both cases, he turns both of them into a chiyuv. And surely that's significant. Now, how can they both be a chiyuv? I mean, especially if you take the view that there's no chiyuv su'uda on Chanukah. So even if there is a chiyuv, of Ha-Nisim in tefillah, it's not obvious that there would be a chiyuv in Birchas Hamazon. But two things I think are the point. Number one, we don't really know that there's a chiyuv in tefillah either, because the only Gemara according to the Rambam is the Gemara in Chavdalid Amud Aleph, right? Secondly, let's remember that the Rambam not only argues with the interpretation of the word Hodah, he also argues about the interpretation of the word Yom Tov, right? Yom Tov, which Rashi said is a Yom Tov made into two of Hallel v'Hodah, but the Rambam says it's Simcha. So what I said before was that the Marshal, even though the Maram Rutenberg says there's no chiyuv suda on Chanukah, the Marshal has a tshuva in which he argues that according to the Rambam that Yom Tov means Simcha, there is a chiyuv suda. And the Bach, interestingly, this is very interesting, everybody knows one part of the Bach. Most people don't know the other part of the Bach. The famous part of the Bach is trying to explain the Shita of the Maram Rutenberg, which is that there's no Suda. He says, how can it be there's no Suda on Chanukah when Suda plays such a role on Purim, right? So the Bach famously explains, the Levush says something similar. The details are different and interesting in an interesting way, but still the thrust of it is the same. And that is the Bach and the Levush basically say there's a fundamental difference between Purim and Chanukah. Purim, the chait was based on physical pleasure. The danger, therefore, was one of physical extinction. And the Yeshua, therefore, from physical extinction, expresses itself also in a physical way. They were nena misuda shel osa rasha. Therefore, they were, in danger of being, annihilated, right? And therefore, we celebrate Purim in a very physical way. And I would add, not just with a Suda, not just with Simcha u'Mishteh, but in the end, with Mishteh v'Simcha. However, he says, when it comes to Chanukah, right, there was no question, was there, of destroying, of losing their lives, of physical extinction. That's because the chet was hitzrashlu ba'avoda, the tmidim and the menorah are the symbols because they require dedication and consistency, and that you don't, when you're lazy, when you're lackadaisical, when you don't have appreciation for those spiritual opportunities, right, that's called hisrashlus ba'avoda, and therefore they were, in crisis because they weren't allowed to practice these spiritual manifestations of their religion. And therefore, the celebration and the commemoration, when this spiritual crisis was terminated, expressed itself in the performance of a mitzvah, in everything but a su'uda. That is the position of the Bach. However, the Bach then goes on to say, however, he says, that's my explanation of the Maram Rutenberg. He says, but I don't think the Maram Rutenberg is really the normative view. I think, based on the Marshal, and based on his understanding of the Rambam, and the minhagim of Ashkenaz that I'm familiar with, he says, in my opinion, really, there is a chiyuv suda on Chanukah. So let me just go one small step further, and that is, I mentioned that the Rambam Perek Gimel Halacha Aleph, which is the background for Chanukah, is very expansive. The Bayis Sheni Kishimolcha Yavon Gazru Gzeros Al Yisrael Bitlu Daitam V'lo Hinichu Osam Lasok B'Torah B'Mitzvos U'Pashti Yonah B'Mamona B'Bnosayim B'Nichzu L'Hechal Parza B'Protzos Timu Taros Tzor Lahem L'Yisrael Ma'od Mipneim Lachatum Lachatz Gadol Ad Shericham Aleim Elokei Avosayim V'Hoshim B'Yadam V'Yitzilim, etc. And then he talks about Malchus Chashmonah. What's the point? If you look, I don't have time to go through all this, but everything that the Rambam refers to, right, is you have to find a makar for. Now, we know some of the basics. We know that it was time of religious crisis. We know that, there were the Chazal say certain mitzvos, Talmud Torah. The Rambam expanded it very significantly. First of all, the word bittul daitam probably evokes Parakeh Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah, where the Rambam talks about the concept of Shas Hashmad, which is defined there as bitlu daitam. There are three bases for Yehorig Vayavor, right? One is the Gimel Averos, the other is Chil Hashem B'Farhesya, and the third one is Shas Hashmad. That's the one without a makar. That's the one that's a little bit more mysterious. I'm not going to go into that right now. That was relevant to what I spoke about last year. But the point I'm trying to make is that Perek Gimel Halach Aleph, the Nosei Kelim, are very challenged to find the chazals upon which all these, crises that the Rambam enumerates are based on. What's my point? My point is that the idea that there was no, physical threat, to Klal Yisrael is not the way the Rambam describes. Pashti Yodam b'mamonam b'bnosayim tzor lahem Yisrael ma'od mehem lachatzum lachatz gadol. This is not all as the Bach and the Levush in explaining the Maram explain. But more than that, the whole idea of Shas Hashmad makes the details pretty much unimportant. Meaning, it's the bigger idea. Every aspect that was meaningful in their lives, the quality of life, spiritual quality of life for sure, but also physical life, all aspects of life. What the Rambam is trying to accomplish in Perek Gimel Halacha Aleph is to expand the crisis. Meaning, he's trying to accurately transmit or convey that at the time of Chanukah, the danger was enormous. Not that it was narrower and more limited. And therefore, the idea that for him, Yom Tov means Simcha, and that also expresses itself in a physical way, as the Bach, not the Bach explaining the Maram, but the Bach in his own preference wants to suggest, makes a lot of sense. But if that's the case, so then if there's going to be Ha-Nisim is not, the expression of Hodah of my Chanukah, that's Neres Chanukah. But if there's going to be an expression of Me'ena Ma'ora, right, and you think there's a Chiyuv Suda, and the reason you think there's a Chiyuv Suda isn't just because of the word Simcha, but the word Simcha is there because you think that, there's a lot more common, in Purim. It isn't Mishtava Simcha, but that it's Suda is understandable, then why should you be Mechalek between Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon? And maybe that's exactly what motivated the Rambam to assume that since tefillah there seems to be a chiyuv, it's not just a choice or an option, a reshus, maybe a kiyum. There seems to be a chiyuv. So maybe he understood that line in the Gemara. Maybe that's Rabbi Hananel understood that line in the Gemara, that even though initially the Gemara thought it was a reshus, but with a qualification, you have to put it in the right place. But in the continuation, when they invoke tefillah, what do you say? Just like tefillah, it's a chiyuv, because the chiyuv simcha is a prominent aspect of what Chanukah is all about. Oh, okay. So that is a suggestion to explain Shitas HaRambam, in a bit of a different way. Oh, in the end of the day, what is the din if you forget to say Ha-Nisim? Right. So everybody, mostly people are familiar again in practice, that we're not choser. Oh, and that makes sense. If there's no chiyuv, then likely there's no chazara. But especially if you think that maybe there is a chiyuv, like Rabbi Hananel, and Rashi. So is there chazara? Or not? So if you look at the continuation of the Gemara on Chav Daled Amud Aleph, the Gemara talks about. The Gemara quotes a brisa of Rabbi. Gemara says. I'm sorry, not Rabbi, Roshia, actually. Okay. Omer Abzeir Zreka Nekot Derav Biadech, the Koi Rab Oshia Kivasei, the Tani Rab Oshia. Yomim Sheyesh Bem Korban Musaf, this is the rule, but it's a bit of a tricky rule. Yomim Sheyesh Bem Korban Musaf, which will translate to mean, we know what it means technically when there's a Korban Musaf. I'll say, days, therefore, that have Kedushas Hayom, Kagon, Rosh Chodesh, Cholosh Moed, right? Arva Shachris Mincha, Mispalel, Shmonesrei V'Omer Me'ena Ma'ora, Ba'avoda. So when there's kind of a Kedushas Hayom, as reflected by Korban Musaf, right? It has a kind of a Yom Tov aspect to it. So then the Me'ena Ma'ora has to be reflected Ba'avoda. In Shmonesrei, V'im lo amar machzirin oso. The ein bahem kedusha lakos. That doesn't mean you say kiddush. Kiddush is reserved for. It's interesting that it's put there because that's also an expression of kedushas hayom. There are different levels of kedushas hayom. You don't say kedushas hayom on Rosh Chodesh. The yesh bahen hazkarat b'birchas hamazon. Yamim she'ein bahem korban musaf kegon sheni chamishi tainios mamados. Then the Gemara interjects, Sheni v'chamishi, ma'ya v'natai. What does that mean? El Sheni v'chamishi v'sheni shaltainios umamodos arv v'shachris mincha mispalel shmona esrei v'omer meina ma'ora b'shomei tefillah. Okay. V'im lo amar ein machzirin oso v'ein bahem askara b'birchas hamazon. So the Gemara basically has two categories. When there's a kind of Kedushas Hayom is reflected by a Musaf, a Korban, then you have Me'ena Ma'ora, and if you omit it, you're Choser, and there's going to be a Me'ena Ma'ora and Birchas Hamazon as well. On days where there's no Musaf, right, there is no Chazara if you omit it, even though there is an insertion, although not in Ritzei, but in Shomei Tefillah, all right? And there's no Hazkarat b'Birchas Hamazon. So all the Rishonim were troubled. What about Chanukah and Purim? Where do they fit in all this? There's no Musaf on Chanukah and Purim. So why is there Hazkarat b'Birchas Hamazon? And if you want to be medayik that they dafka left them out of the list, even though they belong there, so then maybe you should come to the conclusion that im lo amar, then machzirin also. Like, which list does it go into? That's the Bali Tosas are troubled by. They say, one second, the Tani Raboshia says, Mehacha lo avaboy lemifshat le'el deinu maskir Chanukah b'birchas hamazon. The ika lemidchi, the dafke noka tainios amamodos, Aval Chanukah Purim Afal Pishem B'Mkor Musaf Tzarech Lahazkir Mishum Persumei Nisa. The Ipchalek Lemifshat the Dilma Nakat Tainiusum Amados Mishum Tfilas Musaf V'Hu Adin de Chanukah. Miu Af B'Chanukah Purim Im Lorm B'Tfilein Maxzirin Kidatanya Behedya B'Tosefta de Brachos. So Bali Tosis and the Rush, they all say, the wild card of Persumei Nisa, which is brought in the very beginning of the sugya. I should probably finish soon. So I'm gonna okay. But that's brought in the very beginning of the sugya. Maybe that plays a role here as well. The point I'm trying to make is Chanukah Purim doesn't fit, into either of the two categories. And that actually makes sense, not just because of Persumei Nisa, but because of it doesn't have Kedushas Hayom. On the other hand, the role of Hoda'ah is outsized, in this context. The Rif actually has a girsa. Some people claim it's the wrong girsa, even in the Rif, but in the printed Rif we have this, and that is that the Chanukah Purim makes its way into this brisa together with the Mamados and Tainios, etc. It sounds like the Rif, if he has this girsa, really paskins that there is no Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon. Wow. So you have Rishonim who think that there's actually a chiyuv, even though the pashtus of the Gemara is that it's a rishus, right? And then you have Rishonim who think that you don't say it at all, a wide range. Maybe that would be, again, depends on the role of the Seuda, etc. This question, whether it's Me'ena Ma'or, I'm just going to have to skip the end. So let me just mention two things very quickly. The Avnei Nezer that I keep speaking about raises some interesting questions that have some earlier roots in some of the poskim in Shulchan Aruch as well. And that is the possibility, what would happen, let's say, if it was Shabbos Chanukah, let's say, in Tefillah and in Birchas Hamazon, but maybe you could be mechalek between them. This is, I guess, food for thought because we're not going to be able to pursue all aspects of it. So let's say you forgot, Ritzei in Birchas Hamazon, right? And let's say you said Ha-Nisim. So normally, when you forget Ritzei, you have to say, let's say it's Ritzei and Yalav Yavo, right? Right? Whether it's even the Yalav Yavo of Rosh Chodesh, let's say. So typically, the Avnei Nezer's argument is, well, you haven't done anything, so you have to repeat everything. But even others who don't go that far, let's say you have done something, but you have to be choser because you missed out on the Ritzei part. So then the question is, should you be choser also on the part that you did say? So the Avnei Nezer basically said that should depend on whether or not it's midin me'ena ma'ora, meaning it's a din in Birchas Hamazon. The Birchas Hamazon for this day always includes, a reference to Shabbos, a reference to Rosh Chodesh, a reference to Shabbos, a reference to Ha-Nisim. So it doesn't matter why you're choser. It doesn't matter that you already said Ha-Nisim in Birchas Hamazon or Yalav Yavo. In the end of the day, the din of Me'ena Ma'ora is a din in the construction or composition or the kiyum of Birchas Hamazon, and similarly Tefillah. And therefore, if you're choser, you have to choser everything. However, if it's a chovas Chanukah, somehow on this day you have to say these words. You have to express, the motif of Hodah. So as long as what you did previously wasn't batal gamri, it just was inadequate. It requires chazara because you cheated the Shabbos part of it, right? But at the end of the day, if the mechayev was, it's a venue, it's an opportunity to express shavach and hodah for Chanukah, right? Then why would you do it again? You just did it. It's not a din in Birchas Hamazon. So these are some of the questions that come up. Halacha, would you say Bracha Mein Gimel? This is a question that Rav deals with. Would you include Ha-Nisim in that or not? These are some of the questions. But I want to finish. There's much more to say by noting two other things. The Mordechai Al-Atar in Shabbos quotes the Shita of the Rabbi. Rabbi says that in Birchas Hamazon, even though the Gemara has a suffix whether you mention, Ha-Nisim at all, and it ends up not like the Rambam, the way that we have the Gemara. He says, nonetheless, Klal Yisrael has adopted the practice of saying Ha-Nisim, and Kivin de Kiblo Aleh Shavya Kechova, just like the Bahag said about Tfilas Arvis Rishus. Right? The Gemara has a debate whether Tfilas Arvis is Rishus or Mitzvah. There are some indications that nonetheless, even though Tfilas Arvis is Rishus, nonetheless there's Tfilas Tashlumin and things of that sort. So the Bali Tosas all over the place say, it's not the chiyuv of the others, but it doesn't mean literally Rishus. It's like somewhere in between. The Bahag and the Rambam and others came up with a very different perspective. They said, no, Kivan de Kiblu Aleh Shavya Kechova. Since Klal Yisrael accept, the Magen Avraham says, women, have adopted Sfiras HaOmer. So Kivan de Kiblu Shavya Kechova, they're obligated to say. Okay. So the Ravya says something similar about Birchas Hamazon. According to the Bach's reading of the Ravya, he says it only about Birchas Hamazon, not about Tefillah. So you have the ironic situation, which is Tefillah you're obligated to say, Birchas Hamazon you're not obligated to say, but Kivan de Kibbo Aleh Shavah Kechova. Very strange, and he is very, he admits that that's very strange. He said, technically, you can always say Kivan de Kibbo Shavah Kechova, something is a Rishus, so it's a technical point, but I think it's more than that. He also quotes an understanding of the Smag. It's a little complicated. That's why I'm saying it the way I'm saying it. That the Smag doesn't say what the Rabbi says. He says even further. He says, Lahalacha, in Tefillah, you're not choser if you leave out. But if you leave out Ha-Nisim and Birchas Hamazon, you're choser. And the Bach says, you know why? I'll tell you why. Because it's a Yom Tov. And the Yom Tov expresses itself more in Achila. I would have said, because Birchas Hamazon, right, is a Birchas Hodah. And therefore, maybe once we've decided that Ha-Nisim belongs, maybe, it even occupies a greater place. So again, I feel badly, I feel like I'm cheating this topic, but what I'm trying to point out is that there is a range of views about how obligatory Ha-Nisim is, both in Tefillah and in Birchas Hamazon, both in Chanukah and in Purim, and there are some very extreme views that push Ha-Nisim. In practice, I'll give you one other example. Rabbeinu Tam is quoted as saying that even though the Tosefta says and the Psak of all the Rishonim is that if you skip Ha-Nisim in Tefillah, that you're not choser, that's only if you're already Oker Raglav. If you weren't Oker Raglav, then you have to be choser. And the Ri says, like Mehechatesi, where do you get that from? Right? Meaning, there are all these expressions of chumrah when it comes to Ha-Nisim that don't come just from the reading of the Gemaras. They come from a global understanding that somehow being mazkir hoda'ah and Ha-Nisim on Chanukah, or in this particular way, through Ha-Nisim, is particularly critical. And I think that shares a phenomenon with Chanukah in general. The Rambam says, mitzvah chaviva hi ad ma'od. I mentioned that Tosas says, chaviva hi ad ma'od. There's a whole other topic that I'm not going to go into now, which is the concept of mahadrin and mahadrin min mahadrin. And while the Chidushei Agriz, or Velvel, understood that the Zekeli Banbeu and the Hidur of Ner Chanukah is like any other Hidur, it's very bedochak what he says. The Pashtus, the quality of Hidur is different, the financial investment in Hidur is different. The Rishonim who discuss whether, there's a separate din of overlas yasan if you get shemen, so that you can do Hidur mitzvah. I'm not speaking about Hidur mitzvah. The point I'm trying to make is that there seems to be a certain trend in Chanukah, of hachmara, of chumrah, but not chumrah like burdensome chumrah. Like, it's mitzvahs neiros Chanukah chaviva hi ad ma'od, and that Chanukah, the level of hoda'ah is so great that you almost can't accept, omitting, Ha-Nisim from Birchas Hamazon, or maybe in some cases, being choser, if you leave it out. The opportunity, and in a way, that's what the Ravya was saying. It's a very strange idea. You want to say it by Tfilas Arvis Rishus, which is Keneged, Avarim and Pedarim, and, Yaakov Avinu was metaking Tfilas Arvis. But where does it come in saying Ha-Nisim, when you're not even obligated to say it to begin with? So, not obligated to say it to begin with, but the way it developed historically, that, Klal Yisrael took it upon themselves, and they say it, they daven thinking they're going to say Ha-Nisim, Kivin the Kiblu Shavalel Kekova. Perhaps it's not just a technical point, meaning there is something, Pukchazi Ma'amadavar, about the way Klal Yisrael basically embraced the mitzvah chaviva of Neros Chanukah and the expression of Ha-Nisim as a ikar takana, as the way that Rashi puts it, whether it's for the Rambam or Rashi or for these other manifestations, that is truly remarkable. And I think that the reason goes back to this, expansive perspective that the Rambam develops. And that is that the crisis wasn't a narrow one, only spiritual. And even if it was, spiritual crisis isn't just about the performance of individual mitzvos, especially not Shas Hashma. It's about quality of Jewish life. It's like death by 1,000, cuts. The idea that Kihem Chayenu V'Arich Yameinu, that Klal Yisrael, to live a sanctified and meaningful life, requires, the opportunity of spiritual outlets, is a critical notion. And as such, whether it's the bitui, the expression of Neros Chanukah, or it is the, when you say lahashkicham torasecha laviram bichuke ritzonecha, and basically what we're saying is, what is lahashkicham torasecha? I'll just say one word about it and we'll stop. The Mishnah says in Masechet Avos, kol hashocheach, Torah, Toraso, or whatever, hareza b'schai b'nafsho. That sounds pretty harsh. Like people, not everybody has a, a Ravaji Yosef, type memory that they remember everything that they saw, photographic memory, or even a processing, a memory. What does it mean? Kol hashocheach, mitalmudo, hareza b'schai b'nafsho. But the answer, of course, is, the Gemara says in Tmuran, Daf Tazayin, that when Moshe Rabbeinu died, thousands of halachos were forgotten by Klal Yisrael. Whatever that means, I think I know what it means, but not for now. But amnesia, collective amnesia, individual amnesia, obviously that's not what the Mishnah means. What it means is, kol hashocheach. If you don't invest, right, in trying to retain what you've learned, if it's not precious enough for you, if even in the context of pressure, shocheach is a verb. It's an active form. Not, he can't retain, he can't recover his memories, meaning he didn't learn it in a way, or he doesn't make the effort to preserve it, which reflects that it's not very important to him. In the end of the day, when your Yahadus becomes just a memory and not a live experience, when it's no longer dynamic because you can't practice it, right? So, hareza b'schai b'nafsho is a phrase that Chazal use when the opposite, you should be doing the opposite, and hareza b'schai, like it's unconscionable, it's totally unacceptable. Like if you treat this so cavalierly that you just forget it, like, it goes in and out of your memory, you haven't made any kind of effort, to retain it, hareza b'schai b'nafsho. That's not memory loss. That's not onus. That's, a cavalier, approach to what it is that you are processing or learning. So when we say lahashkicham, that's what the Ivanim want. That's what they wanted to do. Lahashkicham torasecha, to turn Torah into a basically dead memory, into just, facts and figures, to take away its dynamism, to fossilize it, if you want to call it that, right? Lahaviram michuke ritzonecha. Chuke ritzonecha, chukim, are the inner logic of the halacha, of Torah. It's what gives the halachic system its independence and its called it transcendence, is the fact that it's chuke ritzonecha. What they wanted to do is they were also very intellectually oriented, a culturally oriented society, but they understood that the vulnerability of Torah life is if you fossilize it or if you kind of just turn it into any regular logic. And therefore the expression of Ha-Nisim, of Hodah, understanding that and understanding the gravity of it is something that Klal Yisrael embraced. And therefore, even though objectively there would be good reason, it's Drabanan, right? It is, it's not exactly Me'ena Ma'ora, it doesn't really belong in Ritzei, there's no Isur Malacha. But in the end of the day, as Persume Nisa, what specific Persume Nisa? As the Persume Nisa of appreciating, what the challenge and the crisis really was, that is something that Klal Yisrael kind of embraced, beyond what was required. It was part of Chanuka, Chavivahi Admod. So as we, move towards Chanukah next week, I think, this is a halachic topic. There's much more to say about it. But I think it's a topic that highlights, an approach to Chanukah which, goes beyond the details, an approach which underscores the gratitude that we should have, not only on Chanukah, but at all times, for Kihem Chayenu, V'orech Yameinu, the opposite of being Shocheach Toraso, being able to embrace Chukei Ritzonecha. Thank you very much.